Welcome to Black History in Upstate New York. This program was produced by Victoria Basulto in conjunction with the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum and funded by the Catherine W. Davis Projects for Peace Fellowship awarded through Colgate University. Black History in Upstate New York will provide a combination of bite-sized informational videos and longer presentations by scholars on historical figures and places that emphasize the crucial role Black Americans have played in the history of Upstate New York. The National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum honors anti-slavery abolitionists, their work to end slavery, and the legacy of that struggle, and strives to complete the second and ongoing abolition, the moral conviction to end racism. The Museum and Hall of Fame's contact information is available on the screen. Hello, and once again, welcome to Black History in Upstate New York. My name is Victoria Basulto, and it is my honor to introduce today's presenter, Norman K. Dann. Dann is a professor emeritus of social sciences at Morrisville State College in Morrisville, New York. He is also a researcher and biographer of Gerrit Smith and the head docent at the Gerrit Smith Estate National Historic Landmark. He is the author of 9 books on the Gerrit and Ann Smith family and their role in the human rights movement. Dann is a founder and Cabinet of Freedom Emerita of the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum. I'd like to now welcome Dann to begin his presentation.
Okay, well, thank you, Victoria, for that invitation. We're going to do a little bit today with the Gerrit Smith Estate National Historic Landmark. And the story has to go back and start with Peter Smith. Peter was Gerrit Smith's father, and he was into land speculation business in the late 1790s and built a business that was important in enabling Gerrit Smith to do what he was doing with human rights issues later on. So starting with Peter, he was in association with a partner named John Jacob Astor, and they, in land speculation, developed an early fortune. And in 1819, after Gerrit Smith had graduated from college, Peter sold his land business in central New York to his son Gerrit. And Gerrit operated that business for the rest of his life. He died in 1874. So he worked for 55 years in the land office in Peterboro, which was his business office. That building is extant and a very historic spot. Gerrit became very philanthropic with his money. He didn't want money. In our terms, he would have been a multi-billionaire, but he wanted that money to be used to help people who were in some way oppressed. So that led him into the 2 issues of, first of all, the abolition of slavery, and second of all, women's rights movement, which was spawned by the abolition movement a little later on. I'm going to focus in this presentation on Black people who came to Peterboro for various reasons and interacted with the Smith family. And it's important to understand that what took place in Peterboro is not just the result of Gerrit Smith alone. His family was important in supporting him. That included his wife and his 2 children. So when we talk about the Gerrit Smith estate, we focus on his name, but it's important to realize the whole family was involved in this philanthropic work for helping other people. I'm going to give this a chronological format, and starting in 1834, when Gerrit Smith was becoming an active abolitionist, he started a school for Black young men in Peterboro. It's a radical move at the time because Blacks weren't supposed to be educated. And the school he started was in association with the American Colonization Society, which is strange in that he hadn't yet gotten into the abolition movement as an extremely active person, although he was very close to doing that. The school operated only for 2 years, in 1834 to 36, and his goal was to educate young Black men, and perhaps they would then go to Africa and help educate Black people there. When he realized the obvious racist implications of such a scheme, he got out of it. and started working with what was called immediate abolition. And the term immediate didn't mean that abolition was going to take place immediately. It meant that something needed to be done immediately about it. He had a meeting here in Peterboro in 1835, October of 1835. There was a meeting scheduled to establish a New York State anti-slavery society in Utica, and the meeting in Utica was mobbed, and the people threatened. Gerrit Smith invited them to come to Peterboro to complete their meeting, and that inaugural meeting of the New York State Anti-Slavery Society took place here in what was then the Presbyterian Church in Peterboro. It is now the Smithfield Community Center and home to the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum. A year later, in 1836, Gerrit Smith was elected as president of the New York State Anti-Slavery Society. And also, within a year, he joined the American Anti-Slavery Society at the national level. Also, at the same time, when he was getting himself into active abolition movement, he was operating an underground railroad station here in Peterboro, a very active underground railroad station, and again, supported by his entire family. One of the frequent conductors that came through Peterboro on that Underground Railroad process was Harriet Tubman. She was here several times, and we have documentation of her sitting in the land office with Gerrit, with 7 former slaves that she had brought with her. And sometimes when there were threats to these folks, which there often were as they moved on their escape north, Gerrit actually went with them from Peterboro to Oswego, which was the connection where they went across the lake to Canada. Gerrit Smith had a business agent in Oswego whose name was John B. Edwards, because he had so much property there along the canal where it dumps into Lake Ontario that he needed an agent there to manage his business. And of course, the agent was also an abolitionist. He wouldn't hire anybody that wasn't. So the connections between them were important, and they wrote many letters to one another, and we can document many things about the people, even terms of names sometimes, that were runaways that went between Peterboro and Oswego and then on to Canada. In 1838, a gentleman named Charles B. Ray visited Peterboro. Charles Ray was a journalist, and you're going to see throughout this brief presentation that Gerrit Smith was very interested in supporting journalism. The reason being, journalism was a major source of public opinion formation in the 19th century. There were no other sources of news. You couldn't go to the radio or the television or the net and find out what was going on. If you wanted to know what was happening in the country, you had to have a newspaper. So there were thousands of them, and Smith would fund the newspaper publishers who were supporting his ideas, especially for abolition. And this gent was one, so he funded him. And later on, Charles B. Ray became one of Gerrit Smith's land agents in his giant land giveaway in the mid-1840s to young black males to try and enfranchise them. They had to have property worth $250 in order to be able to vote, compared to property worth $100 for white males. And you can see how that smells. State-supported racism. But Smith was trying to alleviate that problem by giving away land to young black males so that they would be eligible to vote. And Mr. Ray became one of his land agents in selecting those people. In 1839, the Russell family appears as a significant issue in Peterboro. The Russell family starts in its story with Gerrit Smith's second wife, Carroll Fitzhugh. His first wife was Wealtha Backus. She died 7 months after they were married. And through the Backus family, Gerrit Smith met the Fitzhugh family, one of whom was a 13-year-old young woman named Carroll Fitzhugh. 3 years later, when she was almost 17 years old, Gerrit Smith and Carroll Fitzhugh married. Anne had been brought up in the Fitzhugh family, which was a slave-owning family in Maryland, in the Hagerstown area. And they had sold out of slavery in 1817 and moved to the Rochester area. The reason for that was that Anne's father, William Fitzhugh, was in association in banking with two friends, Charles Carroll and Nathaniel Rochester. They together purchased what was called the 100-acre tract of land on the river in what is now the Rochester area because it was good for water power, and they established the city of Rochester. And that's where Anne lived when Gerrit met her. Now, in 1839, she was getting interested in being involved in the abolition movement herself, and she gave her husband an assignment. She said, I want you to find Harriet Sims, who was her nanny when she was raised in the slaveholding family. Find her, buy her freedom, and bring her to Peterboro. Well, Gerrit loved that idea. He liked to see quick results of his philanthropy. So he enlisted the help of a fellow abolitionist named James Canning Fuller from Skaneateles and gave him a blank check, sent him south to search for Harriet Sims. They found Harriet, still a slave, working on a plantation in Kentucky under the ownership of a person named Worthington. And Worthington was fortunately willing to sell his slave. Kentucky was a border state, sort of on the fence about slavery, and Worthington was there. And he said to Gerrit, if you can give these people a better life than I can, I'll sell them to you. And what he meant by them was Harriet Sims was married, and her name now was Harriet Sims Russell, and she had 5 children and a husband. Gerrit wrote to his agent and told him that's not a problem, just buy all of them and bring them to Peterboro. So they did. Gerrit spent $3,500 to buy all 7 people. And if you need to know how much that means today, you need to multiply that figure by 70, and quite a bit. And they came to Peterboro, and the entire family members, all of this black family, got jobs working for pay in and around Peterboro and local businesses, farms. Some worked on the Gerrit Smith Estate, one of whom was Harriet Sims Russell. And she worked in a building on the estate that we now call the Laundry, because she was the Gerrit Smith family laundress for many years there. So it's a fascinating story within which Gerrit Smith actually buys slaves and brings them to Peterboro to freedom. He sometimes was accused of being a slave dealer because he bought slaves, but it was ironic because he never did that for the purpose of using them. He bought it for the purpose of setting them free. Also in 1839, a young man named Samuel Ringgold Ward came to Peterboro with his family and received an education thanks to the philanthropy of Gerrit Smith. Samuel Ringgold Ward, as an adult, became a very active abolitionist and journalist again, with Gerrit Smith's support. Another aspect of Smith's philanthropy that is important to understand was his interest in education, as we mentioned before, and he contributed lots of money to interracial educational opportunities. It fascinated him that blacks weren't supposed to become educated, and he sneered at the notion that they were innately incapable of learning. So he funded schools like Oberlin in Ohio. He gave a massive donation of land and money to Oberlin College in 1839 to get their institute going. And he also funded Oneida Institute in what is now Whitesboro, New York, up near Utica. It was called Whitestown then. And the president of this interracial educational effort was Beriah Green. Beriah Green was a radical abolitionist who had come from the Western Reserve in Ohio to take the presidency of Oneida Institute near Utica. And he and Gerrit became very friendly as Gerrit kept funding the Oneida Institute. And in fact, when Gerrit and Anne's son, Green Smith, was born in 1842, they named him in honor of Beriah Green. So the connection was very close. Also in 1846, James McCune Smith, the first black physician, medical doctor in the United States, arrived in Peterboro as one of Gerrit Smith's land agents in that giveaway program that we mentioned before. A couple of years later, a black abolitionist from Troy named Henry Highland Garnet arrived in Peterboro, and he actually lived here for about a year and a half with the Smiths while he was doing some of his own educational work locally. And he was very aggressive. He's identified now as one of the first black abolitionists to suggest that slaves should use violence in order to escape and use it as a legitimate technique. This did get picked up by other abolitionists later. While Henry Highland Garnet was here, an interesting thing happened. There were two runaway slaves here, former slaves, and they were the Edmondson sisters, whose picture actually exists in the daguerreotype of the Casanova Convention. And while they were here, their owner was on their trail trying to capture them. And Frederick Douglass knew this. Now, Frederick Douglass had moved from the Boston area to Rochester in 1847. And he knew where Gerrit Smith was and had heard of him, and also knew that these two runaways were here. So he wrote to Gerrit telling him, Gerrit, those two young women should not stay with you in Peterboro because they are in danger. They're of being captured and sent back. Henry Highland Garnet, residing with Smith at the time, saw Frederick's letter and wrote back to him saying, Frederick, don't worry. There are yet two places where slaveholders cannot come, heaven and Peterboro. So that's where that phrase originates. Also in 1848, another, I'm going to call him black man, arrived in Peterboro. And he came many times after that. His name was John Brown. Now you say, wait a minute, he wasn't black. Actually, he was black inside, as is recognized by people who now talk of him as having a black heart. And he identified with African Americans so intensely that he was willing to sacrifice his life in order to achieve their freedom. He said about a decade before he arrived here, he said, I would dedicate my life to the destruction of slavery, his word. And he was on the trail of a process that he thought would accomplish that. And he came to Peterboro, yes, you guessed it, for money. Gerrit was ready to give away money to people who would work toward actively doing something about the abolition of slavery. Now, Brown came here to explain his program to Smith, which was the use of violence. Brown thought, well, we need to go into the South and shoot the place up a bit and make the Southerners so angry they start a war. They shoot at us and start a war because that will end slavery. He was right there, but it was difficult to convince other people of that. And Smith was, at the time, the vice president of the American Peace Society. Why would he listen to somebody advocating violence? Smith was a nonviolent civil disobedience kind of guy. But by 1848, when Brown showed up here, he was tired. He'd been working for a couple of decades to try and achieve abolition, hadn't gotten very far. So this guy's got a new and radical idea. All right, let's try it, said Smith, and he funded John Brown. In my research, I was able to track about $2,000 that he donated to John Brown in the decade between 1848 and 59. Again, multiply that by 70 and you can figure out quickly, he gave Brown somewhere in our terms of around 140 grand. So what was Brown doing with his money? He was raising a little army and feeding them and clothing them and training them and transporting them to do things. And Smith funded Brown's work both in Kansas and at Harper's Ferry. So there's a big connection there between the end of slavery and Gerrit Smith's power-broking funding coming from here in Peterboro. Smith is recognized today as the most powerful abolitionist in the United States among thousands. And that is because of the way he targeted his money. He gave it to people who were doing things that were actually working toward the achievement of abolition. And John Brown was a very important person in that process. A couple of years later, in 1850, Gerrit Smith called a convention to meet in Cazenovia to oppose the fugitive slave bill. It was not a law yet, that was before Congress. And the recommendations, if that became a law, would be that fugitives, former slaves, could be captured and sent back with federal approval. That is, federal marshals would be on their track. And the nasty part of the law, which really angered Northerners, was that even if you, as a Northern resident, did not oppose slavery, you could be deputized and taken into official work to capture runaway slaves. So it made people angry and acted as a pretty good recruiting tool for people who were sitting on the fence as to whether or not they should support abolition. Frederick Douglass had, by that time, as we mentioned, moved to Rochester, and he was invited by Smith to help him organize, plan, and implement this Cazenovia Convention. What resulted from it was a connection between Frederick Douglass and Gerrit Smith that was very important in Douglass's future, because Smith by that time was advocating political action in order to abolish slavery. And he had been very instrumental in establishing the Liberty Party, which was an anti-abolition, a pro-abolition party, trying to get rid of slavery. So the anti-fugitive slave law convention was designed to oppose that new law. And Frederick Douglass, in the process of talking this all over with Smith, sort of converted himself into support of politics instead of what he had been supporting, which was persuasion of slave owners, the moral suasion type of technique where you're preaching to slave owners to try to get them to stop it. And he had gotten away from Boston and William Lloyd Garrison in order to start something new. And he had not embraced politics closely until he was in connection with Smith. Smith also did something interesting with Douglass that's very important. Douglass became a journalist. Smith funded him, of course. Douglass was publishing the North Star, his abolition-oriented newspaper from Rochester. And he had enough money to get the paper going of his own. He'd been to Great Britain and had collected some money there and brought it back with him and started this newspaper in Rochester, but he didn't have enough money to keep it going. So, of course, he came to Gerrit Smith. And Smith loved the idea of supporting journalism that was anti-slavery oriented. So he funded Frederick Douglass at the rate of $100 a month for years. Now, $100 a month doesn't sound like much today, but it would amount in our terms to $7,000 a month. That should be pretty effective in helping a person to publish a small newspaper, and it was. And the North Star became a very powerful organ for recruiting people into the anti-slavery movement throughout the Northeast, especially in the Black community. Also, in 1850, Gerrit was dealing with another young Black person in Syracuse named Jermain Wesley Loguen. Loguen was a former slave. He had escaped from Tennessee in 1834 and went to Canada, and eventually decided to return to the United States and settled in Syracuse. In Syracuse, he ran a very active Underground Railroad station that Smith actually connected with at some times. Smith's runaways usually went to Oswego, as we mentioned before, and went through the help of John B. Edwards. But once in a while, they would go through Syracuse and Jermain Wesley Loguen. And Loguen was a very important person locally in many ways. Of course, he ran an Underground Railroad station that helped probably as many as between 1,000 and 2,000 escapees. And he was open. about it. He advertised in Syracuse newspapers that runaways should come to his house and get help. That was a radical move in that you were breaking federal law and now you were publishing the fact. So he was a very active person. And when people offered to buy his freedom for him, he refused. He said, if I allow you to buy my freedom for me, that will legitimate the existence of slavery, and I won't let you do it. So he stayed a fugitive and made it work. He was also a bishop in the AME church and helped a lot of people in Syracuse, Ithaca, and other places around central New York through that avenue. Another person that came to Peterboro a couple of times was Sojourner Truth. She was here in 1851 and again in 1871. And it was just sort of a friendly visit between Gerrit Smith and Sojourner Truth. She wanted to make the connection because of his known influence in the abolition community. And her association with him, she figured would help out things. Another interesting person that showed up in Peterboro in 1855 through the Underground Railroad was a man named John West. West was deformed in body, but a wonderful, heartfelt spirit. And he became the predominant singer in Gerrit Smith's Free Church in Peterboro. He was called the Dominee as the singer. And the Free Church was an interesting institution. It was established in many communities, part of the Union Church movement in the late 1830s through the 1840s. And it was because the word free refers to the fact that it was free of sectarian identification. There was no denominational affiliation for the Free Church. It was free of that. And that was because Smith thought that denominational connections separated people. And he was looking for ways to unite people. So he tried to get away from the doctrinal differences between Protestant denominations and invited anybody who wanted to go to church to come to the Free Church without any distinction as to what the dogma was supposed to be. And it was a very important institution, especially for the Black people that were local and for the anti-slavery movement, because it became a forum for abolitionists. It was a strange melding of politics and religion, which is generally frowned upon. But Smith did it. And the people that came to the Free Church to speak were usually abolitionists, and sometimes very radical ones. And he was criticized for that, for melding those two institutions. But he found that it worked, and the Free Church actually became somewhat of a surrogate anti-slavery organization in its work, and it lobbied for change. Along with his interest in funding education in 1860, there was a college in McGrawville, now called McGraw in New York, New York Central College. It was interracial. Smith was funding it, and it was in trouble financially. The result was that Smith purchased the college buildings in order to offer them enough money so they could function. And it worked for a couple of years, but eventually it failed anyway. But it was a glowing example of his deep interest in funding interracial education. He also funded Beriah College in Kentucky as an interracial educational institution. In the middle 1800s, 1863 exactly, a man named Hanson Williams arrived in Peterboro. Hanson Williams was a former slave of the Fitzhugh family that we talked about a few minutes ago. He arrived in Peterboro for freedom in the middle of the Civil War, and he became eventually the farm foreman for Gerrit Smith Miller. Gerrit Smith Miller was Gerrit Smith's grandson, born in 1845. In 1869, just a few years after Hanson Williams arrived here, Gerrit Smith introduced into the United States the first registered Holstein Friesian cattle, milk cows. and developed a herd that is still famous for its purity of breed and productivity. And for 25 years, Hanson Williams was his farm manager here in Peterboro. Near the end of Gerrit Smith's life, he continued his interest in funding educational opportunities. He had fallen out of favor with his alma mater as a college student. He graduated from Hamilton College in Clinton and was originally in the 1820s. He was a member of the college board there, the trustees. And he resigned from that because Hamilton College refused to support student anti-slavery activity on campus. That was not unusual. That was common in many colleges across the country. But Smith couldn't stand it, and he resigned and refused to support them. But later on in his life, the college reneged on that kind of an older attitude, and Gerrit Smith funded them dearly. Near the end of his life, he gave them a single donation of $10,000, and there were others in between also. And between 1868 and 1874, he died in 1874. So for the last half decade or so of his life, he was making large donations to Howard University in DC, and they amounted to, in our terms, over $300,000. So he continued major support of interracial educational opportunities right up until his death. The conclusion one can come to after looking at all of this is that what Smith's main theme in life was for viewing other people was to consider them as persons first. That's a very important point to understand about Gerrit Smith. He would see you as a person. I am a person. He is a person. The woman across the street is a person. The little boy over there playing baseball is a person. Once you see people that way, he said, we are all persons first, and thereby we are equal. Any labels should come later and be less significant. You happen to be a male person, or a person who is male, or a person who is female, a person who is old, a person who is black, etc. But the fact that we view personhood as most important makes people perceptible as equals. And that's the way he ran his life. And what it resulted in was an actual implementation of, I think, what we would realize as the golden rule. He called it the self-application principle. He would say, look at what's happening to that person that you're acquainted with. Would you like the same thing to happen to you in your life? See, self-application. If you don't want to have that happen to you, then do something about it for that other person. It was a technique of trying to get people to implement moral behavior along the lines of the golden rule, and at the same time be obviously supportive of human rights activities, because you like your own rights and they should have the same. So I hope someday you get a chance, you'll visit us here at the Gerrit Smith Estate in Peterboro, and we'll give you a tour and see you around town. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Norman K. Dann for that wonderful presentation. I'd also like to thank you, the viewer, for joining us today. This is the last presentation for the Black History in Upstate New York program. If you'd like to learn more about future programming, please visit the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum's website. If you'd like to learn more about the Gerrit Smith Estate, please visit gerritsmith.org. Additionally, please fill out the survey linked in the video description and also available on the screen. Your feedback will help us in the formulation of future presentations and programs like this one. Thank you.